All right, so welcome everybody to the April 2023 Collaboration Cafe, sponsored by the Midwest Big Data Innovation Hub with support from NSF. I'm John MacMullen, Executive Director of the Hub, and today we have the first of two sessions on NSF cyber infrastructure funding opportunities. So today we'll begin with the CISE Community Research Infrastructure Program, and next month we'll explore the Campus Cyber Infrastructure or CC-STAR program. So the Collaboration Cafe is our monthly webinar where we bring together folks from across the Midwest and sometimes nationally as well to talk about new ideas for proposal development and how to build capacity for things like data science and CI within the region. We are part of NSF's network of regional hubs across the country. And so in the Midwest here, we have a 12-state region that we address with our programmatic work. And we have a number of theme areas that are driven by regional opportunities and needs in those states. And so today we'll be focused on one of our cross-cutting themes that applies to really all of our priority areas, and that is CI, with a little bit of data sharing discussion as well. All right, so today, as I said, we're focused on the CCRI program. This is a program within one of the NSF directorates, the CISE directorate, really focused on building CI for research purposes. As we'll see, that is something that they talk about explicitly in the solicitation in several places that need to really focus on research rather than other applications. So this is a pretty long-standing program. It is now on a July submission cycle each year. And so the next submission date will be July 21st, so coming up in a few months here. All right. So as I said, you know, the overarching goal here is to drive research in the areas that NSF is focused on here. We'll talk about who those divisions are within CISE in a moment, but really trying to build infrastructure that's focused on research activities, but beyond just the hardware and software, really building tools, other kinds of resources, services to support users in their use of those systems, and really trying to build a community of researchers through active outreach as a part of these awards. So what does this program look like in terms of tracks? So there's three different tracks, basically. There's a planning track, a sort of medium scale track, and then a larger track. Within the planning track, there's a couple different directions that they're thinking that these could go. Folks who propose to that track could do so with the intent of submitting a medium or grand proposal in the future. And so that is a relatively small amount of funding to develop that proposal, get that community together, think about the outreach and so forth within a year or to a year and a half. The other opportunity is to take that work forward to the mid-scale research program that NSF has. This is a much larger funding mechanism for larger scale systems and other CI work. And so a very different kind of next step than just proceeding to a full CCRI proposal. So in that case, the budgets are larger and they give you a longer time frame to develop them. But that mid-scale program is much bigger. It has very different requirements than the CCRI program. Okay, so then within both the medium and grand tracks, there's opportunities for new proposals, so brand new activities, brand new infrastructure, but also the opportunity to enhance existing systems that have already been funded. And so there's different criteria that they'll be looking for for each of those ways of focusing, but same funding, same duration for medium and grand, regardless of that type. So I said this is a long-standing program. If you look at the number of awards, it's a decent amount for each of those. A good number of planning grants, about 12 medium scale, and then 3 grand awards for each of the cycles. For this program, you do not have to have a letter of intent or a pre-proposal. So that's good, but as we'll see, since this is a multi-division program, I think it makes sense to talk with a program officer within whatever division that you are targeting, because they are quite different in their focus. And so NSF is very interested in talking with proposers to make sure that they are going to receive proposals that are relevant to the division or the directorate. And so in this case, I think that would apply as well. They're very willing to talk with potential proposers. And so reaching out to one of the program officers who are named within the solicitation is a great way to get that conversation started. All right, in terms of eligibility, this is intended for colleges and universities, so academic organizations. They do not provide funding for-profit organizations, and investigators who are not faculty or research staff are not permitted to submit proposals, and you're only allowed to submit 1 per cycle, regardless of your role. So, you know, even if you're co-PI on one and you'd like to be a senior personnel on a second one from a different PI, that's not allowed in this particular case, with one exception. So for the planning track, it is possible for you to be on a separate planning proposal in addition to one of the other types. You can only submit 1 planning proposal per cycle, but if you are on one of those, you do have the ability to be on one of the medium or grand proposals as well. All right, and then collaborative proposals are allowed for this program. And so if you have collaborators at other institutions that are eligible for this program, NSF is okay with you submitting separate proposals from each institution as a collaborative proposal. You just have to designate that in the system when you submit. All right, so let's talk a little more about the guidance for this proposal from NSF in the solicitation. So everything that I'm talking about here today is either from the solicitation or from the program page for this program. I will go ahead and put in the chat here the solicitation text for you if you don't have that handy. Happy to take questions along the way here if you have them. And we won't get into all the details of the solicitation today, but we'll try to hit some of the highlights and some of the gotchas for specific tracks. So as I said, this is a multi-division program within CISE. So CISE, if you're not familiar with it, is the directorate that's focused on computer and information science and engineering topics. There's a lot of different activities within that directorate. And so 3 of the divisions within CISE are represented on this solicitation. Oddly enough, the Office of Advanced Cyber Infrastructure is not one of those, but they tend to focus on larger scale programs within that division. And so the mid-scale program, for example, I believe is within OAC. And so, taking a planning grant from CCRI and moving into that program, I believe would go through OAC. But in this case, we're talking about CCF, CNS, and IIS being the 3 divisions. Each of them have their own focus areas. And so again, understanding what kinds of programs they typically fund, what their needs are currently by talking with a program director is a great idea. So I've pulled out a few quotes here in terms of what this program is focused on. In I think all the cases of the slides here today, words that are in bold directly from the solicitation. And so, you know, whenever your funder is telling you something with a lot of detail and they've bolded the text, you know, that's something to look out for, right? You know, you want to make sure that you're addressing what their main interests are. So in this case, as we said up front, this is very much focused on research. They have some language about, you know, NSF likes to support educational activities, but in this particular program, that is not the focus. And so if the proposal doesn't focus on research that relates to these CISE divisions, it's not going to be received well by the review panel. So it's got to be focused on research. It's got to be focused on the research that these divisions address. And it has to be research that is pretty broad-based in terms of the user community that you are proposing to support. So it goes beyond a single investigator, it goes beyond a single organization, and really is meant to address pretty wide-ranging needs of a larger community. So really important to keep that in mind when you're thinking about what the scope of the proposal would be. Let's talk really quickly about the different elements of the proposal in terms of the narrative. So there's some really good guidance in the solicitation for both the planning style track and then the three other types. There's two different limits in terms of pages for those. So that's important to keep in mind, but very detailed guidance in terms of what specifically they're looking for proposers to include in those sections of the project description. There's also a number of supplementary docs that are required for this proposal as well. Some of those differ based upon the track, but for the most part, these are going to be required for all tracks. And we'll see in a moment here some of the details about this, but really this comes back to their discussion about this going beyond deployment of hardware and software and really thinking more broadly about the services associated with this in terms of user support, the larger community development that is required in order to make this available to the widest audience as possible. And so things like what's your plan for community outreach? How are you going to do that in such a way that you're building an inclusive and broad-based network of people who are engaging here? How specifically are you managing the project in terms of a project management plan and timeline, things like that? Data management plan is standard for almost every NSF proposal these days, as well as other federal agencies, so that should not be a surprise to you. But thinking about some of the outputs from your project that may go beyond the core requirements, things like user documentation or case studies or other kinds of outputs that result from use of the system, those would need to be tracked in your DMP as in terms of long-term access of those and availability. And then finally, I'm sure that most people watching this have some sense of the typical NSF letters of collaboration process, which tend to be a very minimal template that just says, you know, as a collaborator, I pledge to support this proposal in the way that's described. This is a little bit different. This is one of the programs where they want to see more details about what you are contributing as a collaborator or what you're asking people to contribute when you're getting letters from them for your proposal. And so they do give some guidance about what exactly you need to have within each letter and what that should look like. So keep that in mind. It is a little different from the standard template. All right, so a little bit more guidance captured here. This is primarily for the slides for folks to look at later. We won't go through all of these, but again, there's a lot of very specific detail about who they're focused on, what specifically they want to see in the proposal. I mentioned things like the project management plan, the community outreach plans, but at the end of your project, they're not expecting that you're just going to turn off the lights and go home. They're wanting to see what your plan is to sustain this resource that you've created for the longer term. So what other sources of funding are you anticipating seeking to support both hardware and software and all the services that you have built up over the lifespan of this project? And then things like how you measure the success along the way, metrics that address the infrastructure, but also the community engagement as well. So related to that sort of community piece, for a lot of these tracks, they want to see some significant budget allocation for the community outreach in terms of those activities, but they also want to see a staff member who is not the PI be the community outreach director. So basically a team leader for the project focused on that outreach set of activities. Another piece here is developing a community advisory board with people drawn from the user community that you're working with. That is something that we see in quite a lot of these kinds of programs where they really want to make sure that you are focused on the needs of the community and not necessarily the narrow interests of the PI or the local institution. They do talk a little about looking at the landscape of existing CI resources, both in terms of things like cloud resources, but other kinds of test beds that have come online in the past couple of years, making sure that what you're proposing doesn't overlap significantly with those. They're willing to fund things that are similar in terms of style, but not in terms of content, I think, right? And so looking at what projects like Power, for example, do in terms of test beds, if you're doing something similar to that, maybe you should be working with a Power awardee rather than trying to do a very similar thing through this program. If you are proposing into the grand track, there is a project review in year 3. So that's a 5-year program, as we saw. So, halfway through, basically, you've got to be ready for a what we would call a site review. Previously, it's not clear whether this would be an in-person review or a virtual review, but some sort of NSF review at that midpoint, that actually has a funding decision associated with it. So the successful outcome of that review is what leads to your incremental funding for years 4 and 5. So really important to keep that in mind and be aware of planning for that in your budget and in your timeline as well. And then there is an existing NSF-funded virtual organization for this program. And so any awardees from this program would become members of that VO and participate in sharing the outcomes and learnings with other awardees. And so that's a great way to do some networking with other folks who are doing similar work to you and understand the success and challenges that those folks have had along the way as well. All right, let's talk a little about, once you've written the proposal, you get it submitted, how is NSF reviewing these? I'm sure that folks watching may have some familiarity with at least the standard NSF review criteria. So intellectual merit, what's the differentiating features of this that are going to lead to new knowledge and new learnings that nobody has discovered before. What's new there, and then how is that impacting beyond the initial group of people that you're working with? How does that help people with their research? What are some of those outcomes? What do those look like? That's where the broader impacts gets reviewed. We have seen in this solicitation and others recently a more explicit discussion of metrics for evaluation and outcomes assessment beyond some of the sort of high-level broader impacts discussion, and really talking about very specific measurements for success for a system, for example, and its use and again, the details of the community that's using that. What are some of those ways that you're measuring their success and their use and their outcomes? So very important to think about that as a part of your proposal as well. Beyond those standard criteria, there are, for a lot of NSF programs, specific criteria that the review panel will look at. In this particular case, for each of the classes of proposals in the solicitation, they have pretty extensive lists of evaluation criteria that their reviewers will be looking at your proposal in relation to. And so it's really important to look at those up front, make sure you understand what you're being measured against, and then as your proposal comes together, revisit those and make sure you're really addressing those up front for them to understand. I've put some other language in here at the bottom of this slide and on the next slide that is outside of that section in the solicitation, where they talk about other kinds of dimensions that are important to NSF. So on this slide here, they talk about the supplement proposals and the grand new proposals that, or excuse me, the supplement for medium and grand. When you have an existing resource, what they want to see are some of these details about what's different if we give you this supplementary funding. How have you done so far? And how does that relate to what you're doing next? And so, again, very helpful to have this level of detail about specifically what they're looking for those tracks. And again, you can see that it goes beyond the system details and does address the user community, the outreach, the diversity, all the elements that are not part of the technical details of the system. And again, sustainability as well is important here. All right, and then finally, a little more guidance from other sections of the solicitation. Again, they're coming back to this idea that this really has to be focused on research and research that relates to these particular size divisions. It must involve participation by a diverse group of folks, thinking about collaboration across different organizations. What is your plan to enable that collaboration and that broad engagement of people? How are you going to support that very broad set of users? What are the services that you're developing to support their use and make it as valuable as possible to that community? And again, the last point here, understanding who that user community is, making sure that their voice is represented in the ongoing operations and needs, but also for the long term can can their voice be a part of that discussion about sustainability? So that, again, comes back to the community advisory board, but other community engagement is important to NSF here as well. All right, well, that was a pretty whirlwind tour of the solicitation. There is a lot of text and other detail within the document. It's really important to read through that. On the one hand, it's super helpful that they give you that, but it is a lot to take in and a lot to compare against your own proposal and to confirm that you're addressing what they're asking for. So it does require a lot of reading and a lot of work to do that assessment, but it's really important in order to have a better chance of getting funded. So I'm going to stop here and open it up in a moment for discussion. If you have questions, we can put those in the chat. We can have you unmute. We have a relatively small group on the live call here, and so if people would like to unmute and talk about that along the way, I have a couple of discussion questions to get us started. But in case folks need to drop off along the way here, I wanted to mention that we have 2 sessions upcoming in the Collaboration Cafe series. So as I mentioned earlier, next month we'll continue the discussion of cyber infrastructure with the CC STAR program. We're wanting to target small institutions that have not received funding from this program or other CI programs before, and help them understand what some of the opportunities are for funding at the campus level. And so if you are coming from a small institution, primarily undergrad, community college, even non-R1 kind of organization, we would love to have your participation on the call. And then in June, we will be switching to USDA to look at the latest AFRI program from the NIFA division of USDA. So looking at agriculture as the core topic, but data and data science applications there as well. We are continuing this series through the end of 2023 and into 2024. So if you have solicitations or topics that you'd like us to talk about, feel free to reach out and suggest those to us. We're always happy to have that input. But we will continue to plan events, and so check out our website for details on upcoming sessions. All right, so we have a few discussion starter questions here that I'll put in the chat in a moment. But depending upon folks' interests who are on the call today, we can talk about sort of large-scale topics. You know, what are some of the needs that you all see at your institution, or more regionally, more broadly? Who are the people that you think would be benefited from development of a CCRI program here? And then maybe things that are already underway that are at the level of readiness where you could take those forward through this program. So I'm going to stop sharing here so that we can see each other better and have this conversation. But I'll put those questions in the chat for reference as well. But you know, happy to talk through other questions with you if you have them.
Sure. Thank you, Zon. So, you know, this is, I'm kind of new to this specific call. And so what is the major difference between, let's say, MRI proposal, you know, building a computer cluster versus this one?
Yeah, good question, because there are quite a few CI programs that NSF has, and given the different divisions and directorates, sometimes it can be a little confusing in terms of what the goal is there. And so I will try to find here in a moment a slide that Margaret Martinozzi from CISE presented earlier this week at the ACCI meeting that sort of broke down what the difference is in terms of scale and things like that. But my sense is that CCRI and MRI are somewhat similar, but in terms of focus, but in terms of funding, they are very, very different. So MRI is much, much larger, and so therefore, your proposal and your system has to be very different in terms of what you're proposing to create. I think the commonalities are probably the community outreach and engagement dimensions. For both of those, you really need a strong sense of who the community is and what the benefit is, but the resources that are being created are sort of a magnitude of difference in order for those levels of funding there.
Mm-hmm. Sure, thank you.
I don't know, David or Roland, if you have experience with either CCRI or MRI, but if you have other things to add to my answer, I'd be happy to hear those.
I guess I would have a very naive question to some extent. To which extent is, I guess, an MRI, I would mostly think is essentially big for hardware. This one here seems to be a bit more mixed. So there could in principle be a virtual cyber infrastructure that one proposes as well, or is this tied that there needs to be a hardware component to it?
That is a really good question. They do, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, they're asking you to think about, if this is a cloud computing kind of resource, how much does it overlap with other things, especially Cloud Bank, which they have already funded, or if you are developing a test bed, for example, how much does it overlap with Fabric or with other platforms like that? And so that's a little bit of guidance, but I don't have a good sense of, could a 100% virtual system make sense, if you wrap that in a set of services and, a sort of use case that would make sense for versus building, hardware in a building somewhere.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I did find that slide that I mentioned from Margaret earlier in the week. So let me go back and just share that quickly with you so that you have a better sense of the scale here.
Sure, thank you.
All right, hopefully you can see that. And so,
yeah.
They're talking about, we're looking here at the bottom at the CCRI is basically in the middle in terms of where they're situating local versus national, but it is at the low end of the budget range, right? So you have that whole set of programs from CCRI over to the left that are more campus level or local community versus the ACSS and the MRI programs, which are much larger and much more focused on larger communities. And so, you have those different dimensions that you have to think about. If you need to build something for a really large community and you need a lot of money to do that, then, maybe it makes sense to do a planning grant to get that lined up before you submit an MRI proposal, which is a significant investment in time and effort. So why not get paid to do that essentially by going through that planning track and make sure that you have a really solid program, because those are super competitive awards. You want to make sure that you have a very solid proposal if you're going to submit to that. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a better sense, Duka.
Sure. So looking at this, so the x-axis or the below axis is the different mechanisms, right?
That's right.
And then the y-axis is the size, and you also have that community kind of axis. So it looks like it's much bigger than MRI, and also probably it needs more community outreach than MRI. Is my understanding right there?
Yeah, I think you're right there. And you can think about this in terms of other agencies as well. So DOE or other mechanisms that have that scale. They're going to be looking at some of those similar dimensions probably as well.
Sure. So as I mentioned briefly in the beginning, last year we got the MRI. It is I think 499,000 and with cost share 650 or something. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of need for computing infrastructure. And as Roland was mentioning, maybe it could be mix of both cloud computing as well as the actual thing. So if there's an opportunity for us to participate in some form, shape, if and it looks like it needs that regional or that outreach. So probably multiple institutions would be really interested in whatever safe form we can participate.
That's great. So do you want to talk for a minute about the focus of that particular award and what you're all doing there? Where are you thinking about taking that in the future?
Sure. So basically, this MRI is mostly to improve GPU, like computing. So our GPUs were 12 years old. So that's the basic premise. And we have around 26 faculties, where we highlighted their research areas where GPU was going to be critical. So that's how we kind of, build the story or background. And then, so we have an existing cluster system called Superior, and we're just going to kind of add this GPU cluster, to that, or maybe create a separate cluster, but that's the whole premise.
So do you have a particular set of domains or use cases or users that is targeted at, or is it more of a general resource?
So we kind of, classified it to, I think, 3 or 4 groups. And again, like proposal, I haven't seen the proposal after it was funded. So one is basically, applications of deep learning into different domains. So that was one group. We had 4 or 5 faculty members, in that area. The other was faculty doing kind of molecular dynamics type of simulation. So simulation and modeling in physics and, in other different areas. And the other one was actual computer science folks who were, developing some, parallel algorithms and all those things for, for GPU, nodes. So I think we classified it into 3 big groups, and each group had multiple faculty, multiple projects, there.
Yeah, I mean, there's in each of those cases, I suspect that there are many other folks, at least in the Midwest, but beyond as well, who have those interests. Certainly here at Illinois, with the Delta award from NSF that we received, there's a lot of molecular dynamics work done on that, but astrophysics and other things as well. And so I'm sure that the underlying user communities have a lot of shared interests. And so, thinking about other academic departments at other institutions that may be doing similar work could be one way to do that outreach. But, talking with folks at supercomputing centers or at some of the larger R1s that have research computing facilities that have public resources, that could be another dimension. Certainly the folks at MIDAS at University of Michigan could be one group that would have some interest on the data side, for example, in use cases or data sets that would make sense on that kind of system if it were scaled up, for example.
Right. So again, this is just my personal needs. So especially with all the advent of all these, language models like ChatGPT, 3, GPT-4, and all those things. So I work in the space of bioinformatics, and we use protein language models. We just don't train them because we don't have the resources. I was trying to train a GPT-3 model on protein sequences, with one of the collaborators, we estimated that we would need 1,000 A100s for 3 months or so. So again, I'm just throwing out here. So if there is enough interest around language models, right, and applications of language models in different areas, that could be one, maybe theme. But I'm just, like just throwing out things here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's very helpful, though. How about Roland or David? Do you have specific interest in this program in terms of application areas or user communities that are of interest to you?
I'm not right now. I have a couple ones that I think one might try and do, but it depends a little bit on kind of what kind of infrastructure we do. So one thing but I'll have to dig up how this would work, and that's a purely virtual one in the sense it's just a software. So I'm involved with a project called Muses here, which is kind of a collaboration to develop something for nuclear equations of state. The physics is irrelevant there, but with Andrew Manning here, we've spent a bit of time setting up a kind of essentially a set of cloud resources for a scientific developer community that would integrate a Git server, chat server, calendar, file sharing, whatnot. So everything that you would normally piece together from different parts that you can get, say, from GitHub and from say Dropbox or something like that, but it's under one. It has a single access control. And the question would be if you can turn that thing, if we polish it up, if you can turn it into an actual sellable product, where we would say sometimes, oh, if you want to have a collaboration that does work in anything scientific, you probably need the same sort of tools. Instead of having to make everything work with 5 different open source repositories, so 5 different free for money offers that company gives you where you're at their behalf, you could use these, which will run on NSF provided resources, and there would be somebody who maintains these for you, and they might be longer lived or offer better features than you would get there. But that's just a thought balloon at this point.
Sure. And Roland, you're thinking both the kind of the computational infrastructure and then the tools, right? And or the tool that combines all these 5-6 tools that you're mentioning.
Exactly. So that's the idea. And I mean, if you need hardware, then of course it needs to run somewhere. Initially, it could run on something like Jetstream or so, but it might also benefit from having dedicated hardware sitting somewhere. And I mean, doing this with Andrew, it definitely also needs just person power because it just takes a lot of time to administer these things. It's just impossible.
Yeah. I'm going to put in the chat another potential option for you. NSF has a program called POSE, which is not represented in the graphic that I shared earlier because that's more of a hardware focused map. But POSE is a program that's relatively new that is focused on taking more software focused kinds of work and thinking about building user and developer communities for long-term sustainability. And so they do have a planning track as a part of that program where, if a lot of those elements that you talked about are underway already or have, work being done, that may be a situation where you could take that and say, we'd like to develop this into a more of a full-scale end-to-end kind of system that we could have a larger group of folks working on in the long term. So you might give that a look.
Yeah, that might be good. So I said, right, this is just something that, okay, this may be, but it may or may not work in the end.
All right. I guess sort of going back to my questions that I had on my slides, what do you all see particular needs out there that are not being addressed by either current NSF awards or other agency funding that might make sense for the CCRI program? These are obviously things that would be multi-institutional and in larger user communities, but Duke, is there a bioinformatics need, for example, that NIH has not already funded that might make sense here, or some other, disciplinary focus that you all are perceiving from your communities that we could discuss as a regional partnership, for example?
Sure. So as I mentioned, probably so because of these large language models, doing all those things in other application areas, bioinformaticians are paying attention to it, and they are trying to train their own models on the protein sequences, on the protein structures and all those things. So and as these require a lot of hardware resources, and only companies have it, right? I think Oakridge has some of these resources, especially a large number of GPU nodes. But besides that, I'm not really aware of other systems. And again, I don't know. So when I was XC champion, I kind of knew it, but I'm not in that role for the last 5-6 years. So I don't know how like XC and the new version of it are. But I mean, I would assume that probably, institutions don't have that many number of GPUs. So probably something around this generative AI may be a combining theme, and it could be, for example, myself applying it to bioinformatics and somebody applying to, I don't know, like natural language processing and so many other things. But just thinking out loud here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I asked specifically about bioinformatics because I feel like that is a space where there's a lot of agency engagement, but they all have very specific things that, at least historically, they have funded. And so, for example, NIH historically has not done a lot of what we would think of as cyber infrastructure. They have been more focused on data and data analytics.
Right.
Where NSF is much more on the hardware side, but they have not done a lot of biological kinds of domain work. They try to leave that for NIH. And then like you mentioned, the national labs run by DOE are often where there's a lot of hardware that could come into play there, but you have to have particular eligibility to get access to those. And so, yeah, there could be, a sweet spot for some of what you're talking about within NSF, but potentially within NIH as well.
Right. And I don't know, for NIH, probably it has to have that health aspects to it. So maybe NSF, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, NIH, their Office of Data Science has been growing quite a bit, and they have taken on more of that. But yeah, they definitely would like to see a translational element to things that they fund like that. And so you have to think about, patient care and health outcomes and all that,
right.
Which may not be the focus if people are doing basic science, protein dynamics and whatever. So,
right.
All right, we are getting close to the end of our time here today, but any last questions or comments from folks? All right, well, really appreciate you all joining the call today and the discussion. We will check in again next month for CC Star, but as always, feel free to reach out to the Hub if you have interest in talking about particular proposals that we can help with, or getting connected with other folks in the region or nationally for your ideas. We are part of the NSF network, and we engage with the other 3 hubs regularly, and so we're happy to help get connected wherever would be helpful for you all. But thanks again for being here, and we'll look forward to talking again soon.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.